everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Network for Financial Crime Prevention's podcast. I'm your host, Marika Torsdotter, and before we get into today's episode, some housekeeping. If you're not a member yet, I suggest you join us on nfcp.info, and you can find our other podcast episode on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and on our YouTube channel. And of course, follow us on LinkedIn. Please keep in mind that all the opinions we share are our own thoughts in this podcast, so they should not be taken as any legal advice. With that said, let's kick this off. Today, I'm here joined by Francisco. Hi, Francisco.
Hey, Marika, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. So to kick us off today, would you like to introduce yourself with 2 to 3 sentences to people get to know you?
Okay, my name is Francisco Mainez. I cannot really say, what I am now because I'm moving jobs. I'm just leaving Neum, having been the global head of financial crime strategy, and I'm going to join Klarna for a very similar role, leading the transaction monitoring team.
Yeah, and today the topic we will discuss is transaction monitoring, so it fits very well. And that is a task that can exhaust up to 40 to 60% of AML operational resources at financial institutions. So it's a good fit for you to talk around this today. And I know a lot of people use the term transaction monitoring framework and transaction monitoring systems interchangeably, but that's not really the truth. How would you explain the difference between the two?
Okay, that's a tricky one. Very, very quickly, the system to me, like pretty much everything else in the industry is open to discussion. But to me, there's a clear distinction between the system, which is the piece of software, the technology that we're using for detection, for case management, either being in money laundering, in sanctions screening, or in fraud. And then the framework is essentially all the supporting or all the surrounding elements that you need, for the system to work, to get the most out of the system. And I'm looking at things like, for example, your risk taxonomy. The system should be aligned with it. I'm looking at things like, for example, your financial crime typologies library, that it should give you kind of a blueprint on where your detection scenario should be looking at. But always the caveat that typologies are based on the principle that is the stuff that we already know about the bad guys, about how financial criminals operate. But I think you need all those elements. Never forget data, because everybody has this hype about moving into artificial intelligence, but without data you're not going to move very fast, or you're probably not going to go very far. So those are the elements that you need the framework, you need for the framework to work effectively.
So when you walk into financial institutions, based on what you just said, do you have any way to detect if they have a good governance and a good framework, or if they just have a system?
Yeah, probably asking, during the first week or the first few days, like, what is the typology level? Where can I find it in SharePoint or, some other resource? And if the answer is the common, we don't have one, strictly speaking, or we have one that was done by this chap and he left the company 2 years ago, that's a red flag. That's a red flag that, things, you have a system, but you're missing the elements that make the system work effectively.
Yeah, so some red flags there. But if we look at the good side, what would you say would be like 2 or 3 or 4 things that separate a good framework governance from an average one?
The first one is having you mentioned it, having governance. And this is not me being a control freak or having spent many years in large financial institutions where we're all big fans of a committee meeting, but you need that kind of oversight, not just to track things and to show things like traceability and show things like not really who take the decision of implementing this set of rules, but what was the rationale behind it? When was implemented? When was the last time we actually had an assessment review, an effectiveness assessment review of the rule set or the artificial intelligence or machine learning models? So you need that, you need governance, you need a good data plan. Again, never forget data, because transaction monitoring, you cannot monitor anything, you don't have the data to do it. So you need, a data framework. Your data quality officer or your data management officer is probably one of your best friends if you're trying to, push forward a program in transaction monitoring. And the last one is documentation that I mentioned before. It basically proves that there's communication, that there's a solid link between a risk and between risk management and systems.
Just to stay on the data topic, as it comes up all the time, right? But how come it's still a problem in 2026? it's been on everyone's agenda for so long? What do you think?
Because everybody wants to go for the flashy things. Everybody wants to buy software and put it and start clicking things and see what happens. And everybody wants to start populating slides that are basically saying we have less false positives, or we have we're detecting our scenarios are working better. The situation with the data has been so bad in the industry that it's almost like we have learned how to live with that kind of toothache, as painful as it is. And the more you let it fester, in the back of your mind that the more you're going to have, to make a big investment. So when you finally have convinced everybody to give you like $500,000 or pounds to get a new system, now you know that if you say, and by the way, we also need to fix data, and that's going to be another million, they're going to say no to everything. So in many cases, what I've seen is that, well, at least let's get another system and let's see how it works. But again, you're almost like fooling yourself, because you need to fix the data before you embark yourself on a new system. The problem is that acquiring a new system is a much easier exercise than getting the data. Getting the data, you probably need to contact a lot of people within your financial institution across IT, data owners, lines of business, data privacy, responsible, to ensure that there's data privacy and good data management. Whereas getting a system, you basically need to convince, the guy with the money and then IT and say, we're going to implement it. We got the money, we're going to buy it, and now we're going to implement it, and job's done. Fixing the data is a much more complex exercise. And like I said, we kind of learn how to live with a problem instead of fixing it.
Yeah. Right. So if we come back to that chain you talked about, you have the governance down to the documentation, everything that needs to be in place for a good system. Do you see any particular place in that chain where it usually breaks?
I will probably say not just a single point, but several. And
Yeah.
it typically breaks when there's an initial commitment to fix things, but somewhere down the road, the business will probably go one direction. Oh, we're going to expand in this. For example, we're going to go into, things like digital assets, and the compliance is still trying to fix, 3 or 5, old legacy problems. I ride a motorcycle, and sometimes I make the analogy of, 5 of us are going to meet on a Sunday to go for a bike ride, and at the last minute, somebody with a really small scooter is going to join us, and that's probably compliance. And then 2 hours down the road, you turn around and say, "Where's compliance?" I mean, it's probably like 100 miles, behind. And again, it's probably a silly analogy, but it illustrates that at some point, the existence of divergent interest is basically what's leading line of business to go one direction, IT to follow another direction, and essentially you really need somebody beyond all those, beyond all those lines of business and supporting functions to basically say we need to orchestrate this.
Yeah, because that orchestration is also needed, right? Because regulators' expectations, they've shifted from do you have a monitoring to can you defend the outcomes of what you're getting, right? So are the financial institutions, how are they coming along in this journey, in this mindset?
I think that you raise a very interesting point, because demonstrate those outcomes and prove that they work. Actually, it goes hand in hand with all this explainability and transparency that we as that financial institutions are required to provide when they start embracing or rolling out advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning systems, or that type of technology. So you need to prove not only that you're detecting, but what you're doing with it. And again, it raises the point that transaction monitoring sometimes tends to be perceived as a problem with the system, a problem, rules in the system. Nobody's looking at data. And sometimes you have the case of, rules are working well or relatively well, but the output of the rules, goes into financial crime operations, to compliance operations. If they don't have the adequate processes, they're not aligned to, what the risk, we're looking for, to that risk taxonomy that I mentioned. If they're not aware of the typology that can affect the organization, if they don't have, the proper training, then everything falls by the wayside. So, because you have effective rules, the system works, the software is perfect, it's all fine-tuned, it's not producing a high volume of alerts or false positive, but then you don't have people able to find, what is the problem that we're trying to, or what are the risks that we're trying to mitigate, or the red flag was going to lead to a successful escalation of an alert.
So you mentioned the training, which is interesting. Do you see that growing in importance, or are we relying more and more on systems the better the technology is evolving?
Training is another elephant in the room, like data. Probably not as big as data, but it's definitely in there because there's this expectation. And I remember being in a role where I asked, how do investigators get trained? And the answer was like on the job. Or I got another answer, which is not too bad because a component of training should be, learning on the job. But another answer was something along the lines of when we hire them, they're already trained. I was like, wow, that's amazing because let's not invest in training. But the reality, is very, very far away from that. We all know that compliance operations is subject to high levels of attrition. There's a very high, attrition rate. We all know that. It's going with, or it goes hand in hand with concepts like, alert fatigue. It's not a job that you're going to be doing for the next 10 years. Consequently, it's difficult to invest when there's such volatility. Invest in training when there's such volatility in your investigation, teams. The reality, though, is that if you probably read my background, I used to be in the military, and we used to say, whatever you sweat in training, you won't bleed in battle. And it pretty much worked the same way. If you don't train, you're going to be put in front of a workstation. If you're not trained, you're going to be put in front of a workstation, and there'll be a whole bunch of numbers and messages, and even with artificial intelligence, even with the most advanced systems that incorporate high level technology like AI agents that will provide you recommendations on what to do with these alerts. If you don't know what to do, if it's like somebody telling you either you can dispose as a false positive or you can escalate as a level 2 or a level 3, and these are the data points that support that escalation. If you don't know how financial crime works, if you don't have that type of training, you probably won't know what to do. So I think the industry has seen a significant investment now on software. Vendors are matching that demand, and we have more and more, from giant traditional companies, from smaller startup trying to fill that gap, especially in areas like advanced analytics and artificial intelligence and all the rest of it. But the reality is that there's still a training gap.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that, software is becoming more important and we're doing those investments. But how do you see the software being actually leveraged in the institutions you meet?
It depends on, I would probably say you have to look at on a case by case scenario. I mean, some of the roles that I've been working before, I've seen vendors not only deploying the software, but also deploying people, consultants, or, teams, professional services team that can actually help not just installing, but embedding the software and the culture or the new culture associated with the new software, especially if it incorporates, if we're jumping into artificial intelligence and machine learning and all those, new things. Others, what I call the UPS. The UPS syndrome is like UPS. They will deliver a box, they'll knock at your door, and they'll walk away. And it's up to you to survive with it. And then it depends. Some financial institutions, they just can't afford, for a program that will include like end-to-end training and consultancy and fixing all the problems, and then a post-implementation review after 6 months. That leads me to the conclusion that actually what you need to do before even looking at how much money we have to invest on artificial intelligence is, are we ready to move? Do we have the training? And sometimes, again, it's not just about buying software, it's almost buying a lifestyle, if you like.
And you mentioned affordability being a part before you take this decision to get this whole lifestyle. Do you see a difference between how the large financial institutions and smaller midterm institutions are handling this? Is there a gap widening or narrowing, or do you see any differences there?
I think it's been probably democratized, for one of a better description. So it's becoming more affordable because there's obviously, there's more demand, but there's also a lot more offer. And you have, more and more providers coming up with really innovative ideas, ranging from KYC and identification and verification all the way down to what we will probably say is probably one of the last segments, which is automatic report automation for SARS and suspicious activity reporting and suspicious transaction reporting. So it's getting better in that sense because there's a lot more offer. And, the cereal aisle in the supermarket is much bigger. So, to the point that sometimes if you embark yourself on, let's pick another system, you're sitting in the middle of the cereal aisle, looking at how many options do I have compared to just 10 years ago, which is good because you have, vendors really being pushed to compete a lot more among themselves than 10 years ago, where the market was more dominated by a few firms than right now. I think that's, ultimately, I think it's a good thing because it allows more flexibility to potential buyers, to potentially people that financial institutions that they want to acquire new systems, and they can choose between going for a comprehensive solution, going for a modular system, start, baby steps, and we're going to buy a detection module, and then we'll go for a case management, and progressively we'll replace. And it gives them the chance to not to have to make such a large investment at the beginning. By the way, if you hear like weird noises, it's my puppy. We have a puppy dog, and right now he just grabbed a piece of paper and he's basically shredding it to pieces. So if that's the sound, the satisfaction of a puppy destroying a piece of paper.
It's our guest today, and we love it that we have him there in the background. So just to tie back a little bit to this shift you're seeing with, technology, more vendors, it's more variety, but it's also going from the rule-based to more hybrids, and there you mentioned also AI coming in. How do you see this? Because I want to tie back to when you talked to in the beginning about governance and we need documentation, everything. Is this shift making that part of like the governance harder or easier?
I think more than harder is making governance even more necessary than before. I mean, I've been into scenarios where you're asking questions like, why do we have these rules? They don't seem to produce any alerts. They're completely inefficient. We don't even know what risk they have been designed to tackle. And there was nobody or nothing to answer that question. With more advanced analytic solutions, with more artificial intelligence, we need those answers more than ever. I mean, there's nothing because it's more expensive. Then it's easier to go back in time and try to fix a legacy rules-based system rather than now we need to redesign all the model. Maybe they were done by a consultant. Maybe we need to go back to a consultancy again and say we need to redesign the whole detection scenario. So I think things like governance, documentation, traceability, transparency are more important than ever. Also, especially from a regulatory perspective, because the regulator has always been interested. Can I see your framework? Can I see your rules inventory? It's not that difficult to explain rules. I sat in front of a regulator and said, this is how the rules work, and I survived the exercise, thank God. But it's much more complex when you're talking about more advanced technology. It's much more complex when, a rule could be looking at 2 or 3 or 4 parameters. A model could be looking at much more than that and explaining how the machine learning model works, exactly how the feedback loop. So, we effectively have machine learning. What are the data fields that feed back into the model so the model remembers next time and say, oh, actually this transaction is okay, so I'll let it go next time, and I won't trigger a false positive, so I'm reducing the volumes of unwanted alerts. Explaining all that is a much more complex exercise. So again, you better have some governance to explain all that, to provide that layer of comfort to your auditor or your regulator, rather than let's call the consultant back or let's call the chap that left the company 2 years ago and try to fix it, because it's going to be more costly and both in time and in resources.
Yeah, and in this shift and this complexity, do you feel like the institutions you meet are ready for this? Have they shifted the mindset that they need to think about it differently than they did before? Or is that also a learning curve for them?
I think it's a learning curve. If you ask anybody if they want to ride a Ferrari, they'll say, oh, yes, absolutely. I would love to do it. But the reality is that I've never done it, by the way. But the reality is that it's probably, or a Formula One, it's a really, really complex, a piece of machinery to ride. And I think we're looking at a very similar scenarios where complexity has brought more advanced technology, has brought better detection capabilities, but it's a more complex technology. It's still a concept that many people still don't understand. Sometimes I run into conversations that, being a Star Wars fan as well, I think they're thinking about AI as something like, mythical, like the Force, like use AI to fix this, and say, well, do you really understand what AI can deliver in this particular scenario? Can we actually go to something like ChatGPT or Claude, like, open version? Probably not, because some of the data elements are, could be restricted. So just by saying you need to use AI to fix this, is not a solution to the problem. It almost to me equals like, again, the old Star Wars saying like, these are not the droids you're looking for, the old Jedi mental trick. But in reality, things work in a very different way. That kind of complexity, it's almost like what's going on with digital assets. What is the difference between cryptocurrencies, stable coins, NFTs, non-fungible tokens? How can you mitigate the risk derived from that? What are actually the risks derived from transacting with those type of products? And I think the industry in general, it needs a little bit more of maturity and like knowledge on that.
So maturity and knowledge on that, but we also seen like you talk us through a transformation in the last couple of years. What do you see will happen, or do you see any shifts in the next 2-3 years, either technology side or the human side of transaction monitoring?
I think it's going to go both ways. I think there's more and more realization that AI is the way to go. There's more and more realization as well that the bad guys, the financial criminals, are using AI with the advantage of being completely unrestricted. We have to fight AI. We have to fight fire with fire. We have to fight AI with AI. There's no way that you can survive in a system exclusively run by the old rules and fighting things like deepfake or voice clones. There's no way you're going to make it. Or really complex payment structuring, schemes. 10 years ago, you have an Excel guru trying to, on the bad guy side, how are we going to structure $1 million in the next 2 weeks? So it goes under the threshold because they know the thresholds, and in a way that is not gonna raise any alerts. Now an algorithm can do that in 5 seconds. So how are you gonna fight that? Using Excel? No. So you need to use, you can. I mean, you're trying to fight a modern war using swords and sticks and stones. It just cannot happen. So there's a high level of awareness that we need to go that way, but the people are starting to get to the realization that there's a lot of work to do. It's not just pushing buttons and then AI will do the rest. Because yeah, you can probably push a button and AI will do the rest, but now somebody will come and say, can you explain how this happened?
So this is a really interesting topic, and I think we can talk about this for a very long time. But if you want to wrap this up a little bit, if you could choose one thing that you think the industry is getting wrong or it needs to change, what would that be? Like if you could really change something here and now in how they do transaction monitoring.
AI or AI applied to transaction monitoring is not just about numbers, and it's not just about reducing operational costs. It's not just about reducing false positives. Aside from the duty financial institutions have to try to identify and the role they have in fighting financial crime, I think I'll go back to your first question. What is the difference between a system and a framework? It's not just about numbers. It's about everything surrounding the software and the technology.
I think that's a good way to wrap this up, right? Going back to the beginning, the difference of framework, system, and remembering
little guy, you can hear he's getting nervous.
He really wants your attention. But thank you so much for joining me today. And for those who want to follow you and learn from you more, where can they find you?
Very easy to find on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, perfect. And for you listening or watching, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you're not a member yet, join us on nfcp.info and find all our other podcast episodes on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or on Spotify. Until next time.
Thanks, Marika. Thanks, everybody.